March 14th, 1945. Camp Aliceville, Alabama. The afternoon was hot and humid, the kind of heat that made your uniform stick to your skin and turned every breath into a labor. Private James Sullivan, 23 years old, from a small town in Ohio, stood guard at the western perimeter of the camp, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his mind 1,000 miles away. He was thinking about home, about his fiancée, Mary, who wrote him letters every week, about his kid brother, who had just enlisted and would probably ship out to the Pacific within months, about anything except the job he was doing, which is why he didn't see the snake. It was a cottonmouth, one of the deadliest snakes in the American South, nearly 4 feet long, thick-bodied, coiled in the shade of a fence post. And James, lost in thought, stepped within striking distance. What happened next would haunt him for the rest of his life, not because of what the snake did, but because of who saved him. A voice, sharp, urgent, shouting in accented English, "Stop! Do not move!" James froze. His hand went to his rifle, because the voice belonged to a prisoner, a German prisoner, a man named Georg Richter, 42 years old, a former Wehrmacht sergeant captured in North Africa 2 years earlier. Georg was part of a work detail repairing a section of fence 20 yards away. He had seen the snake. He had seen James about to step on it, and in that split second, he had made a choice that made no sense by any logic of war. He warned the enemy. James looked down, saw the snake, saw how close his boot was to it, saw the cottonmouth's mouth open white as bone, ready to strike. He stumbled backward, his heart hammering. The snake, disturbed but not provoked, slithered away into the underbrush. James stood there breathing hard, staring at Georg. Georg stared back, and in that moment something passed between them that neither man fully understood. Not gratitude, not friendship, just recognition. The recognition that beneath the uniforms, beneath the war, beneath everything that made them enemies, they were both just men who didn't want to see another man die for no reason. If stories like this matter to you, listen closely, because this is not a story about heroism. It's not about redemption. It's about the moment when the lines blur, when the enemy stops being the enemy, even for just a second. When a man who fought for a regime that represented everything evil makes a choice that is purely, simply, inexplicably human. This is the story of a Nazi prisoner who saved an American guard's life, and in doing so raised a question that neither man could answer. If your enemy saves you, what does that make them? And what does that make you? History doesn't repeat itself, but it echoes, and if you listen closely enough, you can still hear the sound of a man shouting a warning across a fence in Alabama. A warning that should never have been given, a life that should never have been saved. And the impossible, uncomfortable truth that followed, that maybe, just maybe, the enemy is never as simple as we need them to be. Camp Aliceville was one of the largest POW camps in the United States, holding over 6,000 German and Italian prisoners at its peak. It sat in the flatlands of western Alabama, surrounded by cotton fields and pine forests, a landscape so foreign to most of the prisoners that it might as well have been another planet. The heat was oppressive. Europeans weren't built for Alabama summers, and even in March, before the worst of the heat set in, the prisoners moved slowly, their faces red and slick with sweat. They worked in the fields, on construction projects, doing the labor that American men would have been doing if they hadn't been shipped overseas to fight. James had been assigned to the camp 6 months earlier, after completing basic training. He had wanted to go to Europe to fight, to do something meaningful. Instead, he had been sent to Alabama to watch prisoners. It felt like a punishment, like the war was happening without him. At first, he had been wary of the prisoners, nervous. They were Nazis, the enemy, men who had fought to destroy everything America stood for. But over time, the fear had faded into something else: boredom, routine, the realization that prisoners weren't monsters, they were just men. They complained about the heat, they missed their families, they played cards and told jokes and argued about soccer. Georg Richter was one of the quiet ones. He didn't cause trouble. He worked hard, kept his head down, followed orders. James had spoken to him a few times. Basic exchanges, simple English, mostly about work assignments. Georg's English was decent, learned during his 2 years in captivity, practiced through necessity. But they weren't friends. They weren't even acquaintances. They were guard and prisoner, enemy and enemy. That was all. Until the snake. After Georg shouted the warning, after James stepped back, after the cottonmouth disappeared into the brush, James just stood there, his rifle hanging uselessly at his side, his mind trying to process what had just happened. Georg stood by the fence, his hands gripping a post he had been repairing. The other prisoners on the work detail had stopped, watching, uncertain how to react. James walked toward Georg slowly. His heart was still racing. His mouth was dry. He stopped a few feet from the fence and said, You saved my life." Georg shrugged. "The snake would have killed you, or made you very sick. Why did you warn me?" Georg looked confused by the question. "Why would I not?" "Because I'm your enemy." Georg was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The war did not make you my enemy. The war made me your prisoner. There is a difference." James didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded and said, "Thank you." Georg nodded back, and then, as if nothing unusual had happened, he returned to repairing the fence. But something had changed. James felt it. A shift, a crack in the simple narrative he had been living in. The narrative where Germans were bad and Americans were good, where the enemy was evil and the guard was righteous, where the war made sense because the sides were clear, because if Georg was capable of saving his life, if a Nazi prisoner could see an American guard in danger and instinctively, immediately, without hesitation, warn him, then what did that say about the categories James had been using to understand the world? They expected hatred. They expected that prisoners of war, especially German prisoners, especially men who had fought for Hitler, would be hostile, bitter, dangerous, that they would sabotage work projects, attack guards, plot escapes, do anything they could to resist. But Camp Aliceville, like most American POW camps, was remarkably peaceful. There were incidents, yes, fights between prisoners, occasional escape attempts, but by and large the prisoners were cooperative, compliant, almost disturbingly normal, and that normality unsettled the guards, because it contradicted everything they had been told about the enemy. It contradicted the propaganda posters that showed Germans as monsters. It contradicted the news reports about Nazi atrocities. It forced the guards to confront an uncomfortable truth, that the men in the camp were not monsters. They were soldiers. And soldiers, stripped of their weapons and their orders, were just men. James thought about this as he walked back to the guard station after the incident with the snake. He thought about Georg's face, weathered, tired, but kind. He thought about the way Georg had shouted the warning without hesitation, as if saving an enemy's life was the most natural thing in the world. And he thought about the stories he had heard from soldiers returning from Europe, stories about concentration camps, about mass graves, about systematic murder on a scale that was almost impossible to comprehend, stories that made him hate the Germans, made him believe that every man in a Wehrmacht uniform was complicit in genocide. But Georg had saved his life. Georg who had worn that uniform. Georg who had fought for Hitler. Georg who should have been a monster, but instead was just a man. How do you reconcile that? How do you hold two contradictory truths in your head at the same time? That the Germans committed unspeakable evil, and that individual Germans could be kind, that the enemy was responsible for genocide, and that your enemy might save your life without thinking twice. That night, James sat in the guard barracks, unable to sleep. Another guard, a corporal named Mike Chen, a Japanese-American from California whose family was in an internment camp while he served in the Army, noticed James staring at the ceiling. "You okay, Sullivan?" "I don't know," James said. "Something happened today." He told Mike about the snake, about Georg, about the warning. Mike listened quietly. Then he said, "That mess with your head, doesn't it?" "Yeah." good, it should. What do you mean? Mike sat up on his bunk. My family's in Manzanar. They're American citizens, born here, never been to Japan. But they look Japanese, so they got locked up. Meanwhile, I'm here, guarding Germans who actually fought for Hitler. And some of them are decent guys. Some of them are assholes, just like everyone else. He paused. The war wants us to think it's simple. Good guys versus bad guys. Us versus them. But it's not simple. It's never simple. And the moment you realize that, the moment you see the enemy as human, everything gets harder. Because you can't just hate them anymore. You have to think. And thinking is harder than hating. James lay there staring at the ceiling, turning Mike's words over in his mind. Because Mike was right. It was easier when the enemy was evil. When you could point at a German uniform and know without doubt that the man wearing it was your enemy and deserved whatever happened to him. But Georg had saved his life. And that act, that simple, instinctive act of compassion, had destroyed James's certainty. Over the next few weeks, James couldn't stop thinking about the incident. It gnawed at him, kept him awake at night, made him question everything he thought he knew about the war, about the enemy, about himself. He started paying more attention to Georg, watching him during work details, listening to him talk with the other prisoners. And what he saw confused him even more. Georg wasn't a fanatic. He didn't talk about Hitler or the Reich or German superiority. He talked about his family, a wife and 2 daughters back in Bavaria. He talked about his job before the war. He had been a school teacher, teaching mathematics to children. He talked about books, about music, about the small, ordinary things that make up a life. He was just a man who had been drafted, a man who had fought because his country told him to, a man who had surrendered when surrender became the only option, a man who was trying to survive a war he hadn't chosen, and that made everything worse, because it would have been easier if Georg was a monster, if he was a true believer, if he had saved James's life for some calculated reason, some manipulative purpose. But he hadn't. He had done it because it was the right thing to do, and James didn't know how to process that. One afternoon, James was supervising a work detail when Georg approached him. It was unusual. Prisoners didn't typically initiate conversations with guards, but Georg walked up and said quietly, "Private Sullivan, may I speak with you?" James looked around. The other guards were out of earshot. "Yeah. What is it?" Georg hesitated. Then he said, "I wanted to say, I am sorry." "Sorry? For what?" "For the war. For what my country did. I did not know when I was fighting. I did not know about the camps, about what was happening to the Jews. But I know now, and I am sorry." James didn't know what to say. He wanted to be angry, wanted to reject the apology, wanted to say that sorry wasn't enough, that being sorry didn't erase genocide. But when he looked at Georg's face, he saw genuine anguish, genuine shame. "Why are you telling me this?" James asked. "Because you saved by me that day with the snake. You could have shot me, many guards would have, but you did not. And I wanted you to know that I understand the weight of what I was part of. Even if I did not pull the trigger myself, I wore the uniform. I followed the orders. I am responsible." James looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "I didn't save you. You saved me." "No," Georg said. "You saved me by not shooting me when I shouted, by trusting that I was warning you, not attacking you. That took courage. More courage than warning you about a snake." James felt something twist in his chest, because Georg was right. In that split second, when Georg shouted, James could have turned and fired, could have assumed it was an attack, could have killed Georg without thinking. But he hadn't. He had trusted. And that trust had saved both of them. "What happens to you?" James asked. "After the war?" Georg shrugged. "I go home, if there is still a home to go to, if my family is still alive. if they will accept me back. Why wouldn't they? Because I surrendered, because I am a prisoner. In Germany that is a shame. My daughters, they will be ashamed of their father. That's insane. Perhaps, but that is how it is. They stood there in silence for a moment. Then Georg said, I do not expect forgiveness, from you, from anyone. I just wanted you to know that I am sorry, and that I am grateful, for the way you treated me, for seeing me as human. He turned and walked back to the work detail. James watched him go, and felt something he hadn't expected. Empathy. Not forgiveness, not friendship, but empathy. The recognition that Georg was trapped in a tragedy he hadn't created but couldn't escape. That he was a man trying to live with choices he couldn't undo. That he was human, and that humanity was the most disturbing thing of all. The story of Georg Richter saving James Sullivan's life was not unique. Across the 500-plus POW camps in the United States, there were dozens, perhaps hundreds, of similar incidents. Moments when the lines blurred, when prisoners and guards helped each other, when humanity broke through the categories that war demands. There was the case of a German POW in Colorado who saved a farmer's child from drowning. The case of a prisoner in Texas who alerted guards to a fire in the barracks, saving dozens of American soldiers who were sleeping nearby. The case of a prisoner in Wisconsin who performed CPR on a guard who had collapsed from a heart attack, even though he had no obligation to do so. These stories were rarely reported. They didn't fit the narrative. They complicated the simple story of good versus evil that the war required. Because if the enemy could be kind, if they could be brave, if they could save American lives, then what did that say about the enemy? And more importantly, what did it say about us? The American military understood this tension. They knew that humanizing the enemy was dangerous, not because it made soldiers weak, but because it made them think. And thinking soldiers are harder to control than soldiers who simply obey. But the military also understood something else, that the way you treat prisoners during war determines what kind of peace you have after the war. That prisoners who return home with stories of American kindness, American fairness, American humanity, become ambassadors for a different way of life. That in the long term, treating enemies well is more effective than treating them badly. James learned this from Captain William Harris, the camp commander, during a conversation a few weeks after the snake incident. James had requested a meeting, struggling with what had happened, needing guidance. Harris listened to James's story. Then he said, "Private Sullivan, I'm going to tell you something that isn't in the manual. War is easy when the enemy is a monster, when you can look at them and see only evil. But real war, the kind that actually happens, is harder than that. Because real enemies are human. They have families. They have reasons. They make choices. And sometimes those choices are good." He leaned back in his chair. Georg Richter saved your life. That doesn't erase what Germany did. It doesn't make the Holocaust acceptable. It doesn't mean we should forget or forgive the atrocities, but it does mean that Georg Richter as an individual is capable of good. And recognizing that doesn't make you weak. It makes you mature. But how do I reconcile it? James asked. How do I hold both truths at the same time? You don't, Harris said. You live with the tension. You accept that human beings are complicated, that good people can serve evil causes, that enemies can be kind, that nothing is as simple as we want it to be. He paused. And you use that understanding to build a better peace. Because if we treat these prisoners like monsters, if we dehumanize them the way their government dehumanized others, then we become what we're fighting against. But if we treat them with dignity, if we show them that there's another way to live, then maybe we prevent the next war. James left the meeting with more questions than answers, but he also left with something else. Permission. Permission to see Georg as human without feeling like he was betraying his country. Permission to hold complicated truths without needing to resolve them. And in the months that followed, James and Georg developed something that wasn't quite friendship, but wasn't quite enmity either. It was something in between, a mutual respect, an acknowledgement of shared humanity in the middle of a war that tried to deny it. They called it captivity. But in many ways, the prisoners at Camp Aliceville were freer than the guards. The guards were bound by rules, by orders, by the need to maintain the enemy narrative. They couldn't befriend prisoners, couldn't show too much kindness, couldn't admit that the men they were guarding were often more decent than the men they were guarding with. But the prisoners, stripped of rank, stripped of duty, stripped of the machinery of war, were free to be human. They worked, they learned, they questioned, they changed, and some of them, like Georg, became better men in captivity than they had been in freedom. James saw this transformation in Georg over the months that followed. Georg started teaching English to the other prisoners. He organized a small library, collecting donated books and magazines. He helped settle disputes between prisoners, acting as a mediator. He became, in many ways, a leader, not through authority, but through character. And the irony was impossible to ignore, that a man who had fought for a fascist regime was now, in an American prison camp, learning and practicing democracy, that a man who had been part of a system built on hatred and domination was now, in captivity, building a community based on cooperation and mutual respect. One evening, James was walking the perimeter when he saw Georg sitting alone near the fence, reading a book. James approached and asked, "What are you reading?" Georg held up the book. "The Federalist Papers. Captain Harris gave it to me." "You're reading American political philosophy?" "Yes, I am trying to understand how your system works, how you govern yourselves." James sat down on the other side of the fence. "Why?" "Because after the war, Germany will need to rebuild, and we cannot rebuild the way we were. We need something new, something better. And I think, perhaps, America has some answers." He looked at James. "You are not perfect. I see this. You have your own problems, your own injustices. But you have something Germany lost, the idea that government exists to serve the people, not the other way around. That power comes from consent, not from force. That disagreement is acceptable, even necessary." James thought about Mike Chen, about his family in Manzanar, about the Japanese-American soldiers fighting for a country that imprisoned their families. "We're not as good as we think we are," James said. "No," Georg agreed, "but you are better than what I came from, and that is enough to learn from." They sat in silence for a while. Then Georg said, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure. Do you still see me as your enemy?" James thought about it. Really thought about it. "I don't know what you are," he said finally. "You're not my friend, but you're not my enemy either. You're just someone I know, someone who saved my life, someone who's trying to figure out what comes next. Same as me." Georg smiled, a sad, tired smile. "That is more than I deserve, but I am grateful for it." The war ended 4 months later. Germany surrendered. The camps began processing prisoners for repatriation. Georg was scheduled to return to Germany in August 1945. The night before he left, he found James and said, "I wanted to give you something, to thank you." He handed James a small wooden carving, a snake, coiled, mouth open. Georg had carved it himself during the long, empty hours of captivity. "So you remember," Georg said, "that enemies can be human, that war does not define us, that we choose who we become." James took the carving. "What will you do? When you go home?" "I will teach again, if they let me. I will tell my daughters about this place, about the Americans who treated me with dignity when they did not have to, about the guard who did not shoot me when I shouted a warning. They might not believe you, perhaps not, but I will tell them anyway, because the truth is more important than what people want to hear." Georg Richter returned to Germany in August 1945. His village had been bombed, but his house still stood. His wife and daughters had survived. They welcomed him home, but the reunion was strained. He was a prisoner of war, a man who had surrendered. In a culture that valued death over defeat, he was marked. But Georg didn't care. He had learned something in Alabama that was more valuable than honor, that survival is not weakness, that humanity is not cowardice, that choosing life over death is the bravest thing a person can do. He returned to teaching. At first, the local authorities were reluctant. He had been a POW after all. But eventually, they relented. The country needed teachers, and Georg was good at what he did. He taught mathematics, but he also taught something else. That questioning authority is not treason. That disagreement is not disloyalty. That democracy requires citizens who think, not citizens who obey. He taught in subtle ways the lessons he had learned in captivity. His daughters grew up listening to stories about America, about the camp in Alabama, about the guard whose life he had saved, about the books he had read, the ideas he had encountered, the realization that there was another way to live. In 1960, Georg received a letter from America, from James Sullivan. They had exchanged addresses before Georg left the camp, but this was the first time James had written. The letter was simple. Georg, I'm writing to tell you that I'm getting married. To Mary, the girl I told you about. We're having the wedding in Ohio, and I wanted you to know that you're part of the reason I'm alive to have this wedding. I've thought a lot about that day with the snake, about what it meant, and I've come to realize that it wasn't just about saving my life. It was about reminding me that the world is more complicated than I wanted it to be, that enemies can be kind, that good people can serve bad causes, that humanity doesn't stop at borders or uniforms or wars. I don't know if we'll ever meet again, but I wanted you to know that I remember. I still have the carving you gave me. I look at it sometimes and think about how close I came to dying, and how grateful I am that you were there. Thank you. For everything, James. Georg kept that letter for the rest of his life. He never responded. He didn't know what to say, but he kept it, folded carefully in a drawer next to the photograph of his family. Georg Richter died in 1981, at the age of 78. At his funeral, his daughter Ava spoke about her father, not as a soldier, not as a prisoner, but as a teacher, as a man who had lived through the worst of humanity and chosen to believe in the best of it anyway. My father taught me many things, Eva said, but the most important lesson was this, that we are all capable of good and evil, that the choice between them is ours, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is warn your enemy about a snake. He left the war as a prisoner, and returned as a man who understood that saving a life is never wrong, no matter whose life it is. There is a lesson here, a lesson about the danger of simple narratives. War demands simplicity. It demands that we divide the world into good and evil, us and them, friend and enemy. It demands that we see the people on the other side as less than human, because if we see them as human, if we acknowledge their complexity, their capacity for both good and evil, then war becomes impossible to justify. But the truth is always more complicated than the narrative. The truth is that good people can serve evil causes, that enemies can be kind, that the man who saved your life might have also fought for a regime that committed genocide, and holding those contradictions, living with them, accepting them, refusing to resolve them into simplicity, is one of the hardest things a human being can do. Georg Richter was a Nazi soldier. He wore the uniform. He followed the orders. He was part of a system that murdered millions. That is true, and nothing, not his kindness, not his apology, not his post-war life, erases that truth. But Georg Richter also saved an American guard's life, without hesitation, without calculation, without expecting anything in return. That is also true. Both truths exist. And the moment we try to erase one to make the other easier to accept, we lose something essential. We lose the ability to see human beings as they actually are, complicated, contradictory, capable of both atrocity and compassion. History doesn't repeat itself. It waits for those who forget to listen. And right now, in a world where we are being told every day to see people as either allies or enemies, where nuance is seen as weakness and complexity is dismissed as confusion, where we are encouraged to reduce human beings to their worst actions or their best actions, but never both. The story of Georg and James matters more than ever, because it reminds us that the enemy is never as simple as we need them to be, that the people we are told to hate are human, that kindness can come from unexpected places, and that the choice to see that kindness, to acknowledge it, to let it complicate our understanding, that choice is what separates us from the systems that demand simplicity at the cost of humanity. James Sullivan kept that wooden snake carving for the rest of his life. He died in 1998 at the age of 76. The carving was found in his desk drawer, next to a photograph of Georg Richter and a letter that James had written but never sent. The letter said, "Georg, I've spent my life trying to understand what happened that day, why you saved me, what it meant. And I think I finally have an answer. You saved me because that's who you were, not who the war made you, not who Hitler told you to be, but who you were underneath all of it. And that act, that simple human act, changed my life. Not because it made me forgive Germany, not because it made me forget the evil, but because it taught me that evil is never the whole story, that even in the middle of the worst things humans can do to each other, there are still moments of grace, still choices to be kind, still people who refuse to be what the world tells them to be. Thank you for being that person. Thank you for reminding me that the world is worth believing in, even when it gives us every reason not to. Your friend, James." There are more stories like this one, stories that complicate the simple narratives we tell about war, stories that force us to see humanity in places we'd rather not look. If this matters to you, if you believe that truth is more important than comfort, subscribe to Warden of War. The archive opens every week, and every story reminds us that history is never as simple as we want it to be. Which story should we open next? Tell us in the comments, and let us know. Have you ever experienced a moment where your enemy showed you kindness? Where someone you were supposed to hate proved to be human? We want to hear your stories. Share this with someone who sees the world in black and white. Because the truth is always gray. The truth is always complicated. And the truth is that sometimes the enemy saves your life. And you have to live with what that means.